Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today, we're going to focus on our communities, our cities and towns where we represent, live and go to church. What we're going to do is draw on two of the three understanding place case studies that Mark and I have undertaken or contributed to over recent months, namely thinking about Lincoln and Sheffield. Our third case study is about Basingstoke, but sadly, time limits what we can cover today in 1 hour. So what we're going to do, this hour is about aiming to help us think about understanding our places, how they might enable us to become more effective as Christians in reflecting on, praying about and acting together within our places. And as we start, I just want to make two points, really. First of all, I think I believe that understanding our places is a journey. We all come to it with different knowledge, insights, and experiences, and there is always more to learn. My expertise is stronger on the secular side, having worked with various places in the UK and in other countries over many years. But I am eager to learn how this knowledge might be applied in the sacred dimension to help gather movements and their churches become more effective in how they pray, reflect, and act strategically for their places. So, as well as sharing today, this is an opportunity also for me to learn from your own experiences. But secondly, I'm going to be building on what has been shared before in earlier Gather Movement learning events, and particularly Professor Paul Williams' learning community event in February, which was called How We Can Think About Cities Differently, and Dr. Sarah Williams' presentation on the history of social movements for the recent Theology Day. Both, of course, are on the Gather Movements YouTube channel. So why is this topic important for Christians? Paul Williams answered this question by addressing how we can think about cities differently. And he explained why and how our Christian context in place is that of an exile. In other words, as we become Christians, we are then in a way called out of the world by Jesus, but then we're sent back again into it as his representatives. And as a consequence, we experience what he describes as a sense of not belonging anymore or being out of touch with the places that we come into. But as a result, he suggests that we may respond in different ways. Our first response might be to just assimilate and blend into what's around us. Or a second response might be to just withdraw or go to the edge or go to the ghetto. Or thirdly, suggests that we might just pass through our places as tourists to observe in a very detached way. And he points out that none of these three reflect a missional response. Paul Williams argues that we're not in our places by accident. We are there for a purpose, as ambassadors for the new city in the old one. And to illustrate this, he drew and cited from Jeremiah 29:7 and from 1 Peter 2. But to be effective as an ambassador, it's helpful, or maybe essential, he argues, to be able to both understand and express what is our city. Now, just to illustrate this, a friend of mine that I was at university with, Andy, is a model for an ambassador. He's a real ambassador in the sense he joined the Foreign Office and later became the UK's ambassador in several countries. But I can remember even at university, he was learning languages in his spare time. I think Arabic and Russian at that time, and learning about places. And I'm sure he would have gone into anywhere he was called to be ambassador with a very strong knowledge and understanding of that country. In the same sense, I think we're called, as part of our calling as Christians, to understand the places that we are located or situated in by thinking about them seriously about how they work. So that's in a kind of the introduction you want to go to, and
yeah,
that's
and
really the question one, Mark.
thanks, Paul. I mean, we're always in danger as church leaders, aren't we, of being sort of stuck in our little bit of town or where our church is. And being an Anglican minister, the parish boundary can be quite a powerful, powerful kind of thing that keeps us in a silo mindset. I was struck by your comments when you mentioned about your work in the Deputy Prime Minister's office about how central government can also be a bit kind of siloed in its thinking, and it sees all cities as the same. I know your work has sought to understand that that's not the case. I think you've got a couple of examples to give us of that.
Yeah, so in a minute we will go through some examples from the work that you and I, Mark, have done that explores that issue through the case of Sheffield and Lincoln. But first of all, just want to make the point that actually I think most of us, whether we're experts or we're coming to this new, will recognise that there is something different or distinctive about our own places. And indeed, in the same February learning event that I've mentioned, there were two contributions that I hope Mark might just play for us that illustrates such insights. So first of all, Sir Peter Hayward was just talking a little bit about why Bath is different to London boroughs.
Let's play it.
Two London boroughs and the place where I live, which is the city of Bath. In Bath, we've got a history going back to the Romans, and it's a fairly small place, like 100,000 people, compared with a London borough, which can be 3 times that size. And so we carry a lot more history. We carry some negative aspects of spirituality because of that history here, which is different from in the main city. But equally, we have the benefits, I think, of more of a sense of place, a natural sense of place, than you do when you're in the borough of London, for example.
And then second, Tani Omade just talked a little bit about his insight about Liverpool and its people, a city that I also know quite well from a research project I conducted from the Centre for Cities.
Hopefully you can see this.
I think it's been a long journey, being in Liverpool and observing what God has been doing over many years. Liverpool has a huge history, and with its past in slave dealings and all manner of things that have affected the city historically. And so the city, also the image, it was wealthy. Liverpool used to be very wealthy, so it had a huge image. Some say that it was for some time like the capital of the nation. So it had a history, but then that was merged in all manner of things. And so by the time I came into the city in the 80s, it was really broken. Militant tendency and various things that impacted the city. So it was a broken city with very low image, financially virtually bankrupt, and so the spiritual landscape was actually broken, just like the financial state of the city.
So, I mean, obviously it's very interesting to hear. These are just people making observations about the places. And as we go on, we're going to develop how you might think about your place. But before that, I think Mark's going to sort of suggest that we do an exercise just to get ourselves started at this point by thinking about your own places before we start going on to some of the ideas and theory behind how you might do this.
Yeah, so great. Welcome back, guys. I hope you managed to chat a little bit together. I'd love to, as I wasn't in your room, just hear what you said. What was perhaps a couple of distinctive characteristics about your place? Nigel, would you kick us off from Swindon? Have you got anything you can share?
Yeah, I think my two are, one is kind of history around railways, Great Western Railway, kind of the base where engines were made and all that kind of thing. And then something completely different, which is around now kind of rapid growth and quite what I would describe as a low self-image as a town, really.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Let's go over to Northants. Steve, would you give us a couple of words?
Yeah, I'm in Corby in Northamptonshire, so that was a big steel town. Went through all of that growth very quickly. It was known as Little Scotland here. The train station was there, but the train station shut. But that's been reopened in more recent years, which is great. And a lot of people have moved up from London. There's a lot of development because it's not a bad commute about from here. It's about an hour in by train from here. So that's brought a different change, different demographics. So a lot of Scots here still, but a lot of people come up from London, multinational. So that's changed a lot of the dynamics as well. The town centre was very much developed at the time of the steel town, so it was very run down, but is now more modern. So and a lot of housing growth, which is happening around the country as well. But it's one of the biggest places, I think, for house building around here at the minute. So yeah.
Okay, going through a real regeneration. Thanks, Steve. Kola Wole. Forgive me for saying your name wrong. Perhaps you can tell us how you say your name.
Yeah, you're 80% there. So well done.
You're kind.
Yeah.
Give us a couple of words. Which bit of London, which borough are you in?
Barnet.
Okay.
In Barnet, obviously, as you know, there is a lot of, as you say, affluent areas within Barnet itself. But we're discussing in our group, and we looked at even generally. So London generally there's a transient nature to things. So people are constantly moving on or coming in, and that sometimes affects any kind of work you're trying to do within the community, because the group of people you're working with this week might not necessarily be the people you deal with in the next 2-3 months down the line, because they moved somewhere else, somebody else has moved there, then you got to start all over again. And then the second thing was, which obviously Paul mentioned earlier on, which was the disparity. I mean, and I sort of highlighted it that if you look at the way wealth distribution is in London, there's a lot of contrast in there. So for instance, the example I gave was, you'd see a particular road sometimes within the street in London, and on one side of the road, that's very single road. One side of the road, you have people obviously in buildings who are affluent, and then the other side of the road, you have people who are not, they're up there struggling, the house properties or whatever the prices is not even 10% of what the other people are just across the road is. And it's that kind of disparity that you see pretty much replicated all over London.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, really interesting. Let's just have perspective from up north. So Sam, just a couple of words from you on distinctive characteristics about Harrogate.
Yeah, so Harrogate is between Leeds and the Yorkshire Dales. So I think that leads to a couple of distinctives for us. So the first one is that we're known for our natural beauty. So we're a spa town, and we're also kind of gateway to the Yorkshire Dales. So that definitely is part of what defines us. I think the second thing is that we're known as quite a healthy, wealthy, happy, affluent town. I think the narrative locally is, but there are lots of pockets of deprivation. I don't think we know what deprivation is actually, but that's the narrative, and that comes from, I think, a lot of people who are perhaps working in Leeds and commuting from Harrogate, but also people come to Harrogate, they don't really leave. So there's a lot of inherited wealth there as well. Yeah, those would be the two things: beauty and affluence.
Yeah, very interesting. Quite different again, isn't it? Thank you. We're going to move on just because of time. But Paul, can I hand back to you? Tell us how you identify difference in cities.
Okay, well, you've already given some interesting clues, because people have picked up already one or two things that are important to this. So understanding place, I think really importantly, goes beyond just observing place, although to observe is really important part of that. But we're wanting to move beyond that, so that we don't just want to observe, but we want to then begin to think and collect evidence to understand more fully what is particular about the place that we are ambassadors for. In other words, what is its language, or how might that place speak to us and to others? In doing that, one of the traps that we can easily fall into is to identify our place, whether it's a neighbourhood, a town, a city, or even our country, as a space that we kind of put a neat boundary around, as if it's sort of isolated. But in practice, whatever the spatial level is that we're interested in, places are not like islands that are surrounded by open sea, but they're actually interconnected through flows, movement, and connections in lots of different ways. And we've actually heard one or two examples of that in the introductions that you've given. What I want to do today is touch upon 3 such ways and illustrate how they might impact on how we understand our place. And these are history, geography, and relationships, all of which come together and interact in place. First, and we've heard some examples already, like the example from Corby, for example, and from Swindon, places are shaped over time, or shall we say history. And I think that the talk that Dr. Sarah Williams gave, which explored the role of history for the Gather Movement Theology Day through 3 fascinating case studies, is a very good example of this. And I will suggest that if you haven't listened to Sarah's talk so far, that you do so. And I'm also going to illustrate then how history has led to different outcomes in different places through the case studies that I share with you in a few minutes. But secondly, places are influenced by geography. Where places are positioned, for example, concerning other places, natural resources and the connectivity are important. And again, we've heard that in the example of Corby with the steel industry, and Swindon with the history of the railways and so forth. So you can understand that geography in that sense also plays a very important part of it. And then third, relationships. Places are not static, but dynamic in all sorts of ways, in that flows shape how we live our lives. Where we live is not necessarily where we work. We go for education, or what we shop or enjoy culture. We may move house, it may be locally. In fact, most people move quite locally, and sometimes further afield. And some in our community will come from very far away through immigration or as refugees. Also, the industry in our area will have relationships with place through its trading and supplier relationships. So these things, all 3 of them, are very important to understand how a place works. So back over to you, Mark.
Great. Well, we're going to go and look at these case studies, Lincoln and Sheffield, just to get more of a picture of the things that you're talking about here. So,
okay. So what we're going to do is just look at a couple of case studies, and I am going to start with Lincoln as a kind of first one. I think it's disappeared. Oh, here we are. And what you're looking at here is an interesting slide, and the one on the picture of England, or parts of England, you can see in front of you, is a picture of travel to work movements that are from different cities. So all the lines going out, for example, from Lincoln, because we're focusing for Lincoln, or represent travel to work movements. Now, first of all, on visiting Lincoln, it's obvious that it is a very special place. The cathedral and the castle dramatically overlook the city and its surrounding rural landscape for miles around. Lincoln was developed by the Romans, positioning on Ermine Street, connecting London to York, and on the Fosse Way, linking it to southwest England. It offered an excellent defensible site, and the Roman-built canal connected the city to the River Trent and the east coast for trade. In medieval times, it was the 3rd largest city in England, but today has a modest, compared with its larger city neighbours of Sheffield and Leeds, a population of just around 100,000. So what happened? Obviously, it would take too long to fully explain today, but I just want to make 2 observations. First, history, geography, and relations have enabled 2 distinctive characteristics of Lincoln. Lincoln is relatively unusual as an English city, in that it is an independent economic centre. In other words, if you look at that slide, you will see that the travel to work movements for Lincoln stand alone. They don't actually bump into any other city. They're far enough apart. And there are very few examples of English cities that actually do that. York possibly, Norwich certainly, Exeter is another example. So there are relatively few ones that do that, which means it's actually, its economic area that works in is very much the area that's around it, the region around it. And so that is a very important thing that's about it. The second, so it becomes a kind of independent economic centre that combines a self-contained travel to work area that doesn't actually bump into other cities and has a separate local economy. But also, going back to that previous slide, it's also a regional services city, a city that has grown by supplying employment opportunities, retail and other services to its wider region, which offers both opportunities and challenges for the development of the city. The second issue, which has come up in interviewing there, that pride, or rather perhaps the wrong kind of pride, has played a role in losing opportunities for the city. At the early age of the railways, local decision makers opposed the possibility of Lincoln being on the mainline rail route connecting London to York. I think they the local MP felt it was a fad that wouldn't stick and wasn't worth pursuing. But it also may have played a role in the redirection of the Great North Road away from the city, which obviously left Lincoln to some extent isolated from the main north-south links that go from London up to York. Transformed Lincoln has come to understand the significance of the wrong kind of pride in the city and has had such success from preying into that issue and the issues that it has actually created. If you just think about the previous slide, there's a building there, which is the Guildhall building, which I'll refer to in a minute as well. But one of the kind of issues looking at this slide in front of you is that overall Lincoln is not a wealthy city. Only a few small areas of the city actually lie in the 9th or 10th deciles of wealth. So they're kind of the darker blue ones. And largely the darkest ones are actually outside the city in surrounding villages. Nevertheless, there remains a high degree of social segmentation within the city. And the most deprived areas lie along the former central industrial area with its Victorian housing at the bottom of the hill, and in the pre-war and post-war housing estates in the north and the south of the city. A social divide between the growing industry downhill and affluent cities of uphill is highlighted by Michael Jones in his History of Lincoln. And actually, interestingly, he cites Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, who in one of his other roles as a government inspector made observations on his report in Lincoln of 1712. The lower city was ragged, decayed and still decaying, whilst the upper city was congenial for its architecture and the company that it provided. Our interviews that we undertook revealed that the long-term legacy of this actually is true today. For example, it was reported how the Guildhall and the Stonewall building, which was shown in the former slide, which actually operates between the lower and the upper city, is an emotional barrier for many from entering the upper city even today. And that many living locally in Birchwood, on the edge of the city, never set foot in the central city. And these social divides provide a challenge for today. So you can see there again how history, geography, and relationships are playing a role in shaping how you might think about the city and understand the city today. If we move on to Sheffield, this diagram is taken from a study that I was involved in looking at northern city regions, but it shows the kind of travel to work movements that take place. So Manchester is a very monocentric city with lots of movements going out from the centre. Leeds also is slightly polycentric in the way it works, and Sheffield has very few actual movements that occur within the city. So if we kind of think about these three cities, it's really quite interesting to compare them. It doesn't take long on a visit to Sheffield to recognise that the city is actually very special. It feels friendly, relaxed, green, and attractive in its layout of villages spread across its 7 hills. It also seems different to its neighbours of Leeds to the north and Manchester to the west. Leeds and Manchester contributed alongside Sheffield as industrial giants of the Industrial Revolution into the 20th century, but then they followed different paths. Leeds grew from being a market town to becoming a network centre of the wooden industry before diversifying into engineering and other industries. It expanded as a regional service centre with a wide range of service and retail industries. Manchester was also at the centre of a network of towns and villages across the northwest as a regional and international industrial marketplace for cotton goods. And then it also diversified to become an important industrial city and later as a regional services city. By comparison, Sheffield grew to become an industrial giant on a more localised basis. The steel industry that it was famous for was localised around Sheffield and Rotherham, and together with the industry's source of raw materials, coal and water, that supplied the industry's development. So as a result, unlike Leeds and Manchester, it never became a regional services centre. Even today, it retains a higher proportion of manufacturing than its core city neighbours. It's also reflected in Sheffield city centre, which is more compact and less regional than those of its core city neighbours. Sheffield is a more localised as a centre for employment, with the strongest travel to work relationships between Rotherham and Sheffield, reflecting the contiguous built-up area and historical interrelationships of their economies. So you get a very different type of pattern of understanding how the city works, which in turn has affected the kind of relatively lack of civic confidence in the city. So if we go forward on to then thinking more locally, a very common observation that was made during our visit was how Sheffield is 2 cities. One that is relatively well off and the other that is disadvantaged and poor. And this index of multiple deprivation map clearly shows that there is a clear physical divide between the west and the east of the city. And 2 conversations with church leaders in the east side of the city clearly illustrated the impact of these disparities in people's lives. They're reflected in poorer health, lower life expectancy, broken families, low incomes, low educational attainment, higher unemployment and underemployment. And people's social social networks also very limited, often local to the estates that they live in. And this may impact, for example, the vocation of church ministers. 2 that contributed to this review came from the estate areas in which they now minister, and to which they saw their commitment to be there as long-term, as important. And it was interesting that there were parallels in those conversations between their experiences and those you might find with people on long-term overseas mission.
That's really helpful, Paul, and so helpful to begin to see the big picture of our places. We're going to go back into our discussion groups now, and I've got 2 further questions for you to think about. I will cut and paste those into the chat. Again, if you're going into the chat room, you might need to just make a note of these, cut and paste them into another document on your computer. So here we go. We'd like you in your breakout rooms to think about your places again, but this time to try to travel a bit deeper, to reflect on the characteristics of your place that have been influenced by history, geography, and relations. I think we touched a little bit on this earlier, but if you've not sort of thought about that, then do try and articulate that. And then a second part of this, how would you use what you learn about your place to shape your prayer and missional strategy as Christians and as the local church? Welcome back, everybody. I hope you were able to have enough time for conversation there. So we're going to bring in Sean Wade and Paul Blundell now, who are from Lincoln and have been part of the process that Paul has led there in terms of the Place Review project. So we've been asking you to think about how would you use what you learn about your place to shape your prayer and missional strategy. So Paul, would you kick us off maybe to maybe think about where you're going with the Place Review that's done in Lincoln, maybe how it's helping you think about prayer and missional strategy from your point of view?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mark. Firstly, a huge thank you to you and to Paul for the work that's taken place. It's been really good. I think firstly it helps you to lift your head. And you said at the start, you know, as hello, around. So as church leaders, you can often get into kind of fixed on where you are, your geography, your kind of place, even in a city or in a town. And I think you can kind of get your head down, focused on the work that you're doing. But what this has really done is lifted our heads to what else is going on across the city. How is the city seen, and what is the history of the city, and what is the nature of the place that we live in and call home, and how does everybody view that? And I think just gathering all of that information into one place, both the stats, I was saying in the group discussion we were in, I thought it was fascinating looking at Sheffield, just the deprivation and kind of those type of things for me visually really help. And so when we've pulled all of those things together, it's just been a wonderful kind of place to be able to see all of this in terms of what is the history, what has taken place, what is going on, and to place ourselves within that in the sense of, well, where are we right now, so we can work out where we're going, what needs dealing with, what are we heading. And I think for me, I'm a firm believer that our prayers really are perhaps, Sean, if I talk prayer, do you want to talk mission? Does that sound good? Let's make that up right now. But I think in terms of prayers, I think what we have is this sense of what has God done, what is God doing now, and what does God long to do in the future. And I think when we get all of those bits together in terms of the history, we can see those things as a rich history in Lincoln and Lincolnshire around revival and other bits, and so we can tap into some of those things. But there's also the pain, the difficulty, the decisions that have been made that actually have caused problems, and then you see actually the spiritual repercussions of those and the mapping over of those spiritual picture and the physical world as well. So I think unpicking all of that within prayer for me becomes a really important aspect of what it means to stand at the gates, at the city gates, but also to be watchmen and watchwomen on the walls, and to say we're prepared to take responsibility for our city. And so this report has really just helped get us a timestamp almost in terms of where are we now, what has happened, what is taking place right now, so that we can begin to look at where do we want to head for the future, and what is God looking to do. So our prayer, and I think I'm increasingly leaning towards this in terms of my prayer, and I may well be wrong and might change this, but increasingly leaning towards a prayer strategy that is asking God what is he wanting to do, and then just praying those things. I think I've been in too many prayer meetings where we're trying to tell God what to do, and I've done that as well. But I think I'm just increasingly in the slower pace of waiting on God. God, what are you doing? What are the words you're looking to do? What's your heart for this moment? And then getting that heart and then praying those things into place, and prayer strategies around what do we sense God longs to do, and then really seeing the prayer and the mission coming together hand in hand, and working together, because prayer has to be the engine and the foundation for those things. Not a tag on, it's not an added thing to try and bless or make something happen. It's got to be the foundation, because we hear from God. We are really just talking back to God what he gives us and what his heart is. And that's when I think the doors open and mission begins to work. And I know, Sean, the way that you live and work is to embody that. And so perhaps, Sean, if you want to jump in terms of mission and things about how that works, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, because I don't think anyone else in our city is going back to 1100s and seeing who we are as a city. You know, you kind of have your 4 to 5 year kind of vision plans, don't you, done by the city council and the others, and kind of they're all very short term. What can we achieve in this short space of time? But actually having the opportunity to say, what has God actually been doing over the centuries? What has created us to be who we actually are? I think we've loved the process with Paul because it's been able to extract some of that really incredible treasure from some of our civic leaders as well, like some of the conversations. A lot of the information about the city is held in people's heads, but nobody anywhere is sewing that together and saying, this is the picture of our city. So even one of the people that Paul interviewed was the leader of our city council, Rick Metcalf, who he's been in our city council since 1984, and he's retiring this month. So if we don't extract that information now about what he knows about our city, then it's not going to be part of the future conversation as well. And it's been really, really fascinating then to kind of to see what God's been doing. We often, when we've prayed around the city, we talk a lot about the seeds and the weeds. So the whole thing of there's weak parts of our city. So we've talked, pride has already been mentioned. We know that's going to be something that we need to look out for in the future and be very aware that that's something that if you water it slightly, it's just going to go big. Similarly with the seeds in terms of what God has done in the past around mental health, for example, and that being something that he's used Lincoln for in the past with the Samaritans being started here and things like that. So it's interesting as we've missionally started to water some areas of the city. As soon as you water that area around mental health, it's just gone through the roof with the nightlight cafes and everything else. So it's really interesting because I guess it's that whole thing of you work with the momentum of where God is already working, rather than coming up with your own plan and asking God to bless it. I think that's been a bit of our kind of learning journey along the way. Sometimes you just feel like you're flogging a dead horse when it comes to certain aspects of areas, but then you water one bit and you see that really God is in this and it's then something that can be given out nationally as well to elsewhere, because I think each of our individual places has got its own unique contribution to give nationally, to different areas and different aspects. So I think that's a really important part to start asking ourselves, what is it that God's placed within our DNA as a city or a town or a village or wherever we are, and what's our offering then back into the UK as a whole. So I don't know if that's enough about mission, but I could talk forever about it.
Great, Sian, thank you. I'm going to invite everybody to ask you and Paul questions if they've got any, but also Paul Hildreth as well. We've got two Pauls, so it could be confusing. But yeah, I guess we have seen that what Paul is offering here is as a form of mapping, really, helping us to understand the context of our places. That is a really important place to start. But there's inevitably a journey with this that actually we want to apply in our places, and that's going to involve training and equipping of our churches, and some kind of engagement activity, perhaps beyond the churches as well, with other organizations and certainly the public sector. And then implementation, what is the right strategy, and hopefully it's collective and that we actually see transformation of our places. So, Sian, I guess I wanted to ask you any initial thoughts in Lincoln. I know we only done this process recently in Lincoln, but any thoughts about that pathway in terms of using this place review process as part of a series of stepping stones forward to kind of create this kind of collective action together?
Yeah, I think on a local level, we've now got a really incredible document that we can take into different environments, have conversations with sectors about what their future vision is. We've got our civic prayer breakfast coming up in June. We want to give a copy to every single person coming there to see, kind of look, it's a living document, isn't it? Something like this will be continuing to grow and develop, but it's a real gift to the city. So I think anything that we can do to help other cities and towns as well in that sense, I just think it's really important. I think that the church has a real handle on this stuff and can then lead their areas in that. So I can't actually remember what your question was, Mark. That's helpful.
You did well. You answered it well, actually. It was about how we use this kind of context place mapping and move it forward to kind of seek a collective action across our city. So a document to share is certainly that, isn't it? It's a tool to share. The civic prayer breakfast. I guess you'll see where it goes from that. You'll explore, opportunities to talk
Yeah.
about what you've learned and
We've got an opportunity at the moment to join the City Council in helping them to write their 2030 vision. So,
Wow.
you know, you'd bring this document to the table. Why wouldn't you? Do you know what I mean? And start to have a bigger picture conversation rather than let's just constantly put out fires. Well, what is our longer term vision for the city and how do we move into that? So I think that's really important.
It's so fascinating to hear from you down the road about how those conversations go and perhaps what you are surprised by from some of those conversations. I'm sure God will use that.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Steve, thank you for putting your hand up. Do you want to share your question?
Yeah, it just great to see the IMD stuff, the indices of multiple deprivation, because I think it gives you that graphical picture as well. I did some work for the National Footballing Organisation, but it involved Sport England as well. So they were mapping sporting facilities to get people healthy, obviously from that perspective. But there's different ones as well, isn't there? Like crime and housing and that sort of stuff. Is all of that being considered, you know, sort of in a consistent way for, as Sean was saying, if these things are going to mash together for the national, it's sort of getting that interconnectivity as well at all of these different dimensions.
Shall I answer that one?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, they can be, and I think they're obviously available. I've tended to use the composite one because partly I'm trying to paint a big picture, and I'll help places to paint a big picture. And one of the dangers of using statistics, you go into lots of detail and lose sight of the kind of bigger picture. And as Sean say, it's like the history on a bigger scale, geography on a bigger scale, and this one. And also, actually, very often, if you go into one indicator and put the maps against each other, you'll find that the same places have the same problems very often, that they're replicated. It's unusual for one place to have you know, a very poor housing indicator, for example, not to have high levels of crime. They tend to correlate quite well together. So yeah, they're all there available. People can go into them, and if there's something interesting, so one person in Lincoln said, could you look at the health stuff? So I put in a slide on health, and very happy to do that. But I'm very much, the approach I'm trying to take with it and working with others is this big picture. You know, let's try and see the big picture of how everything comes together and avoid going down the route of just lots and lots of detail and losing sight of what the big picture is.
Yeah,
I might just add a comment to that, which is that we've been using a mapping tool that maps what churches are delivering in these different themes, whether it's food security or mental health or homelessness and housing. And you know, as we start to begin to engage with other organisations, it's great to be able to show how the church can respond across a whole area, particularly in relating it to the mapping that Paul's been showing us today. So if people want to search social action mapping on the Gather website, you'll see there's resources around that. But that's another step that perhaps goes hand in hand with what we're looking at today.
Does that map towards in a similar fashion type thing? I know something that's in Corby that's come up elsewhere today as well, is that division within towns and cities. You know, so for Corby, for instance, there's one that's in the 250 most deprived areas, but there's just that one ward. Opposite is an affluent ward, but there'll be people who children attend from the more affluent place into that ward that gets different things. So they're bringing different dynamics as well. But yeah, so I understand what Paul's saying, I think, but I suppose on the ground, building these plans up, it's sort of being aware of these. I suppose it's getting more divisive in places where people who are quite affluent are living people that are less well off.
Yeah, yeah, and certainly, you know, this mapping, whether it's the place reviews or other, is to look at where the gaps are in our communities and to say that actually we need to do something about that collectively, don't we?
Yeah, thank you.
Perhaps for very historic reasons as well as current reasons. Any other?